Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Wendy Kline, historian of medicine at Purdue University and author of books including Exposed, The Hidden History of the Pelvic Exam, Coming Home, How Midwives Changed Birth, and Bodies of Knowledge, Sexuality, Reproduction, and Women's Health in the Second Wave. All books that we discussed today in one form or another. We started off by talking about the pelvic exam as a rite of passage, sort of, particularly for American women, and how routine pelvic exams became normalised in the 20th century and how they were developed. We spoke in detail about the sometimes sinister history behind the creation of gynaecology as a medical discipline in the 19th century, and how Victorians reconciled themselves with, on the one hand, a great preoccupation with female modesty, and then also the popularization of a medical discipline which necessitated male doctors looking in extraordinarily intimate detail at women's bodies. In the extended part of the episode, we spoke more about obstetrics, which of course is also developed alongside gynaecology, and this very long-standing feminist relationship with these medical specialties, which on the one hand have of course brought enormous blessings to women in terms of saving their lives, saving their health, protecting them from pain, but also have sometimes caused a lot of harm. The second wave feminist efforts to encourage women to, for instance, learn how to do cervical exams on themselves, to use speculums on themselves. Books like Our Bodies, Ourselves, the importance of that, and also the home birthing movement, the Leche League, all of these late 20th century movements, mid and late 20th century movements to give women more knowledge about their bodies, in some senses to challenge the medical establishment and the still very difficult attitude towards pain relief in labour. It has not always been the case by any means that feminists have always been opposed to women experiencing pain, while male doctors have been blasé about women experiencing pain. Quite often the opposite. In fact, it's quite a complicated story. That extended version of the episode is available, as always, at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find the whole back catalogue of extended episodes, ad-free extended episodes, and also the MMM chat community where there's lots going on, book clubs, meetups, everything, and of course the bonus episodes that I do regularly with my husband, all available at louiseperry.substack.com. Wendy, should we start by talking about whether or not the pelvic exam is still really necessary? So it's a very old, as you go into at length in the book, it's a long-standing type of exam, and women in America in particular undergo it a lot. Is it as medically necessary as those patients, I suppose, optimistically assume?
It's an excellent question. It's debated a lot among both healthcare providers and among patients. The obvious development that has swayed many people is advances in HPV testing, which is, of course, the cause of cervical cancer. And so if you can be screened through blood work, why should you bother having a vaginal exam is kind of the debate that people are having. I'm not a scientist, right? I can't necessarily weigh in on the medical side, except to say that for many healthcare providers, part of the procedure is also enabling a closer doctor-patient relationship, which encourages women to ask more questions about their bodies. If there are any abnormalities that can be felt or seen that might not appear through, for example, an HPV test, then many people think it should still be offered in the least.
Have you seen the new Barbie movie?
Yes.
Right. So at the risk of offering a spoiler, there's this particularly funny line at the end where Barbie goes to her gynecologist for the first time. And I always find this peculiar as a Brit to hear American women talking about my gynecologist. I have literally never been treated by a gynecologist. I've never encountered a gynecologist clinically. How often are American women undergoing pelvic exams now?
Well, it's changing a lot. And it was fascinating while I was researching this book to understand some of the differences between the UK and the US, in that we do tend to have relationships with a gynecologist. That's typically where we would go first for our annual screening.
Annual.
And so, yes.
Right.
It's in the midst of change. So previously, for decades, it was recommended for any woman 18 or over to have them annually. And now it's 21, and it's more typically to be 3 years. But that's still very, very different from the UK system, right? In which you don't have that kind of annual.
Yeah, I think it is 3 years now, roughly, although uptake is quite low, as you write about. But you'd get it in the UK, you get it from the nurse in your GP surgery.
Right.
You wouldn't see a specialist.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's almost in the US for decades, and I write about this. It's sort of like a coming of age ritual. You turn 18, you go see the gynecologist. And it was also, of course, directly linked to sexuality because it was required for anyone who was getting a prescription for the birth control pill. And now those two have been gradually decoupled because there's a recognition that it's there's no direct connection between needing a pelvic exam and getting a birth control prescription. It was sort of like, well, it's a 2-for-1. You go in and you get both. But because more and more young women were avoiding that trip to the gynecologist from the stigma, there were more unintended pregnancies. So that was part of why those two became dismantled. But literally for decades, it was the same. Like if you became sexually active, you went to the gynecologist, you got your pelvic exam, and you got your birth control prescription.
What were they checking for before giving a birth control prescription?
I think probably just any abnormalities. And again, I think it was more seen as a 2-for-1, that this was their opportunity to do the pelvic health screening, checking for cervical cancer, because you've got the patient in the room already with her legs spread, right? And so that was the primary connection between the two. But as I said, that has changed since then. It's still, though, a very, very different storyline between the UK and the US in terms of expectations and assumptions about what needs to be checked and why.
Yeah, I mean, I'm 7 months pregnant right now, and I also have. I'll sometimes read American health literature, which will talk about, like, ask your doctor, ask your obstetrician. And I'm like, who's that?
Right.
Who's that person? Because, we just don't have anywhere near that level of contact hours with doctors. A lot of this stuff is done by midwives. I mean, I think this is probably for good and ill. The impression I get from America is there probably is, unnecessary pelvic exams is a good example. There's probably is a lot of unnecessary medicalisation. But then also, to some extent, what's going on in the UK health system is it's all done on a shoestring. And we're possibly not getting as much care as we might like.
It's a mixed bag for sure, right? I mean, I completely agree that the American system is highly medicalized, and there's a lot of emphasis on screening and prevention. And on the one hand, it can save lives. On the other, there are some, as I write about, some side effects, I guess I would say, with buying into that system.
So the pelvic exam may be unique among exams, although I did think actually when I was reading of sort of the counterpart for men is the prostate exam.
Right.
Which normally when you see it culturally represented is played for laughs. It's a humorous thing in a way that the pelvic exam for women is not. It's more likely, as you say, to be a source of discomfort verging into distress, shame, whatever. The two exams they're not really symmetrical in terms of how they're popularly understood.
Yes. I mean, I completely agree. If anything, as you were describing it, I thought about childbirth as the one that is more likely to be shown in popular media and is sort of a humorous, right? The woman screaming in pain and screaming at her husband or whatever as a sort of a sense of comic relief in a lot of movies. But it's almost as if the pelvic exam is so, inappropriate to be shown or talked about, that we don't even go there, right? The safest thing is to talk about the pain of childbirth, but not about the penetrative nature of the pelvic exam.
And the transvaginal ultrasound as well, which is sort of similar, although you don't have that horrible cranking that's involved with the speculum. Yeah. Okay, so first question. At what point does it start becoming, in medical history, at what point does it start becoming routine for doctors, invariably male doctors, to be doing these intimate exams on their female patients? Fairly late in the piece, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would argue it's directly linked to the development of the pap smear, right? So this is, Papa Nicolau comes up with this procedure, the screening procedure, in which he discovers you can actually see, with regular smear tests, the early signs of cancer. So it fits right into our mantra of early prevention saves lives, in which, all types of cancer screening push that idea. He initially develops it in the 1920s, but nobody really takes it seriously. He's a zoologist. He's not a medical doctor. He's originally working with guinea pigs, and then he doesn't have regular access to bodies because he's not a medical doctor. So he does it on his wife. He does cervical smears on her for decades daily, and starts seeing and recognizing that this is a potential preventive screening test for cancer, cervical cancer. It's formally developed in 1943, I believe. And by the US, it becomes a regular procedure starting around 1949. It's much later in the UK. So it's relatively late in the game in terms of what I argue is a shift from pathological gynecology or surgical gynecology in the 19th century to preventive gynecology in the mid 20th century. It's really a boon for gynecology because suddenly, instead of letting the patient decide, maybe I need to see a doctor because I'm having some pain or fertility issues or something like that. Now it's like, well, I'm healthy, but I need to go in for my annual checkup. And so suddenly their clientele, explodes as a result. Many of these doctors in the mid 20th century are actually pushing for exams twice a year, not even just once a year. So if you think about, it's a real boon for gynecology as that shift happens into what they call preventive gynecology.
And then in the 19th century, we have the rise of gynecology in terms of the pathological side of things, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a little bit more complicated because there's obviously obstetrics along with gynecology. So the typical patient, if you will, of what becomes an OB-GYN is either someone who's pregnant or having some kind of pain, right? Often dysmenorrhea or amenorrhea, absence of periods or extremely painful periods or difficulty with fertility issues. But they're also seeing, pregnant women such as yourself on a regular basis as well.
For women who can afford it, presumably.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I know the subject of your most recent book, but something you write on elsewhere is also the rise of obstetrics and as displacing female midwives.
Yes.
Which is a very interesting history, and also a history that has been sort of put to feminist ends and has often been a source of great feminist interest. The kind of popular narrative, which is maybe not quite right, but it is compelling, is of sort of this female domain, female area of wisdom being wrested from women's hands by male doctors. Maybe we could talk about that now. Maybe this is a good juncture to kind of insert that bit of the medical history.
Yeah. I mean, you have the emergence of what was called the man midwife or the male midwife, really starting in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. It's also linked with the rise of these medical instruments, right? So you go from this kind of all-female space where no men were in the room, not even the husband frequently. And it was more of a communal experience, but with expertise, right? with midwives who knew what they were doing, studied through an apprentice system. And then you have these men barging in, and offering both the use of more instruments and such as the speculum and forceps, and then also with drugs. right? That women, especially upper middle class women who they believed experienced more pain because they were more civilized. And so there's a theory about pain and civilization and race as well. That, so for example, Black women did not feel pain, but that wealthy, elite, upper middle class women were suffering from pain. And so the best thing that could happen was to give them a few drops of laudanum or opiates or something to help relieve the pain, which not surprisingly led to often complications with the birth. So there's frustration on the part of these midwives who have to kind of watch this process, watch the power being taken away from them and turn birth into something that was seen as meaningful and spiritual and communal into something as dangerous and pathological and medical as well. And gynecologists and obstetricians have to make an effort to convince the public that, in fact, they are more experienced or better qualified to be at a birth than these midwives. They recognize, right, that they have to make a case. So you see these letters between midwives or in their obstetrical textbooks kind of justifying why they should be in a room rather than these female midwives. And so they really emphasize that birth is this pathological, it's almost like a disease, right? And they're there to quote unquote cure the problem by delivering a baby safely and also making the woman more comfortable. So there's a lot of fear mongering as well, that birth is dangerous and it's also very painful, and we can take care of both of those for you.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, in terms of which offered better clinical outcomes for women, it's not really clear because like forceps do save lives sometimes. Some of these interventions were good also, or ended up being good, except for a long time, right? Famously, Semmelweis's observations that, you tell the story.
There was this, it's a larger history about public health and understanding about how disease transmission, but for one of the reasons when childbirth moves into the hospital, and again, as you pointed out, this is primarily upper middle class women who can kind of afford to give birth in a hospital rather than at home. And initially, it was much more dangerous in the hospital than at home because they did not understand disease transmission. And you have these doctors that that are basically going from room to room, or sometimes from the morgue to a delivery without washing their hands, and they're spreading puerperal fever as a result. And so, but none of this was understood until Semmelweis makes this connection. Should have been somewhat obvious if you notice woman after woman dying in childbirth as a result of infection, that perhaps the cause could have come from disease transmission. But nevertheless, it was definitely more dangerous during that period. So we're talking late 19th century to give birth in the hospital because the spread of infection was much riskier, right, in a hospital filled with sick people than at home.
Yeah, I mean, also true for going back to the pelvic exam and the rise of gynecology. So often what you see in this history is that these innovations do eventually lead to better outcomes for patients. And we're all now so pleased, that we have modern gynecology and obstetrics, but that that initial period normally is pretty bad news, or at least bad news for some. Well, I mean, I'm sure we'll get on to the development of gynecology and the use of slave women's bodies. But also for, say, yes, the women giving birth in hospitals at a period where actually it is more dangerous to give birth in a hospital because of the disease transmission. Like, it's a rocky road getting to these good outcomes often, and it can take a really long time.
Absolutely. And I think that part of it is, it's about nuance, right? It's about not making assumptions that technology is always the solution, or an over-reliance on technology. This assumption that EFM, electronic fetal monitoring, is always going to be the best path to preventing any kind of dangers in childbirth, when in fact there's been studies that shown that that's a problematic conclusion to make, that there isn't necessary correlation between one or the other. Or, another way to think about it when I talk to obstetricians is that medical training along the way, there's been something lost as well as something gained. That you may gain the technology, but then the training, an obstetrician isn't necessarily trained to use their hands as much, to palpate, to understand by feel, and to rely on technology to provide the answers for them. Because sometimes technology screws up, right? And then what do you do? So I think this this is a broader, I teach history of medicine and public health. And one of the first things I try to convey to my students is that we're into a culture that kind of celebrates innovation and technology and discovery as all leading to progress. And we're less focused on what is potentially lost along the way, or just questioning the technology. Are we sure that all the answers lie there?
Yeah, and there's always a strong urge within medical science to be overconfident on the latest thing. And there are so many examples of this. Like in the mid-20th century, the push to get all women to use formula and to give up breastfeeding, which was then reversed. You see this happen continually. So there does seem to be a sort of, I guess, a kind of personality maybe that's drawn towards this kind of style of innovation, which is both, good in the sense that obviously you do sometimes create these fairly miraculous technologies. And the thing is that childbirth is painful and dangerous. It just is. It always has been. And to some extent, what we're trying to do in lowering maternal mortality is keep mortality levels artificially low. Right. So you do need a level of kind of artificial intervention in order to make that happen. But there's clearly a scientism drive often within the discipline, and an overconfidence within the discipline that causes tragedy often.
Right. Absolutely. And if you just look at maternal and infant mortality rates in various countries, there isn't a clear correlation between the amount of money spent, for example, and good outcomes, right? And the U.S. is a great example of that. It's the most expensive place in the world to give birth, but look at the outcomes. They're not nearly as good, for example, as in the U.K. And the U.K. uses many more midwives than obstetricians, right? So there's this I would say an over-reliance on obstetrics for what we call normal birth, right? Obstetricians are great and necessary, especially when there's high-risk situations. But they don't receive the same type of training that a midwife does for, again, normal birth.
Although, of course, the conflict that we've had in the UK system of late has been around actually midwives trying to discourage the use of caesarean section, trying to exclude obstetricians from the process. There's this still quite serious conflict between the two professions and lots, which goes back, as we know, centuries. I know that in the NHS system, it is actually cheaper to deliver through caesarean, even though caesarean is, for the system, even though caesarean is more expensive upfront, because you're so much less likely to cause long-term brain injury to the baby, which is enormously expensive to the state in terms of long-term support that then has to be paid out. So, it's difficult, isn't it? And this is the thing, maternal mortality, I think people have a bit of a tendency in looking at this history to probably overestimate maternal mortality and maybe underestimate child mortality. I forget the numbers now, but my memory is that actually, in the sort of pre-modern environment, your chance of dying sort of per pregnancy is not that high, actually. I mean, you'll know, every woman will know a woman who has died in pregnancy or soon afterwards, but it's not as dangerous as just childhood, which was spectacularly dangerous for a long time. Do we have any idea what proportion of women would, if we didn't have modern obstetrics, what proportion of women would die in childbirth?
I mean, it would certainly be high, and I'm in no way suggesting we should do away with obstetrics. It's just pointing out that it's a field that is very research-based and reliant on technology in a way that doesn't always make it a better outcome, I guess is all I'm trying to say. And and part of what was lost along the way is, for some women anyway, the meaning, the experience for the laboring woman, right, who may become scared or fearful or avoid a hospital because it feels over medicalized, and that in turn could lead to bad results. So it's sort of understanding it as both a medical event and something that has meaning for the family more generally.
Yeah, and that isn't strictly an illness in the way that most other things that we'll see you put in front of a doctor are.
Right.
Yeah. Many of you will know that Christianity is a subject of fascination for me, and the role of Christianity in shaping the modern world is a theme I return to again and again on the podcast. My view is that we really can't understand the world or ourselves without getting to grips with it, which is why I'm very glad to point you towards a new online course called 321. It's an introduction to Christianity that's imaginative, thoughtful, engaging. It assumes absolutely no prior knowledge. It's presented by the wonderful Glenn Scrivener, who has been a guest on the MMM podcast previously, and I've also been a guest on his show. Glenn presents 8 video-led sessions which are based around some beautiful animated stories that illustrate the Christian message. You can check it out for free at 321course.com/MMM. Just enter your email, choose a password, and you're in. There's no spam, there's no fees. Just visit 321course.com/MMM. And now onto the show. Should we go back to the gynecology? The development of gynecology, right, which comes a bit later than obstetrics. Should we talk about James Marion Sims? Because he's such an important figure in this history and also such a sinister figure in lots of ways.
Yeah. And, so many scholars it was almost difficult to jump into this in writing this book. There was no way I could avoid James Marion Sims, but I was entering into a very, a crowded terrain, I guess. No, that's not how I would say it, but there's a lot of people who have weighed in on this. Was he a terrible guy? Was he, where do we put him? A good example of this is the removal of his statue, which happens in 2018 in Central Park, close to where he had a hospital once he moved from the South over to New York. And so the debate became, how do we remember people that made some contribution to our history on the one hand, and have been kind of honored and valorized for their contribution for decades or centuries, and yet acknowledge the mistakes that they made or the fact that they relied on a system that we no longer believe to be okay. I didn't say that very well, but do you know what I mean? So he, on the one hand, did save lives, and the kind of procedures that he developed on these enslaved women proved to be life-saving down the road. And so we don't want to discount that, but to also acknowledge that in the mid to late 19th century, he took advantage of the fact that he could exploit Black female bodies, because these were not people who could say no. They can't consent by virtue of the fact that they are enslaved. And so while they were suffering, many of them had countless surgeries done, 20, 30 surgeries in this area for vesicovaginal fistulas. And it was painful, right?
Can I just check? These were women who had got fistulas from childbirth?
Yes.
Okay.
They got fistulas during childbirth. They had prolonged labor. And what's not clear is what caused the fistulas, because it could have been from forceps, going back to our earlier conversation, that tearing as a result of forceps in a difficult delivery. So that gets the question of cause and effect. And so, yes, they survived the delivery, but then they are in, enormous pain and discomfort and are having difficulty functioning, and of course, difficulty functioning, which means they're also unable to do oftentimes their labor as enslaved people, right? And so there's an incentive on the part of the enslavers, along with an incentive on the part of James Marion Sims, to fix these women, because as property, if he can fix them, they can get back to work. On the other hand, that doesn't rule out the potential or the possibility that developing these life-saving measures also benefited them on the side. And there's a great scholar, Deirdre Cooper Owens, who is well known for writing on this. She wrote a book called Medical Bondage. And she points out that within this system, many of the enslaved women ended up working alongside James Marion Sims, or assisting him, I should say, in these procedures. And so they were developing nursing skills that contributed to this whole scenario. So it's a complicated situation, but there's no question that society benefited basically on the backs of these enslaved women who didn't have a say. That conversation needs to take place in order to acknowledge that that's the way in which this whole science developed, essentially.
Were there operations unanesthetized because anesthesia wasn't available at the time, or because Sims didn't want to use it?
That is up to debate. I think this is in the 1840s when he's doing these procedures. Anesthesia was extremely risky, and most medical schools were not advocating the use of anesthesia in surgeries because of the risk of death. He then moves to New York City. He opens up this women's hospital in the 1850s, which is primarily for white women. And there he is using anesthesia. And that argument has been used to point out that he was inherently racist and he was opting not to use them on women of color while he was on white women. The problem there is that a lot does change in terms of the understanding and use of anesthesia in that one particular decade. So it's not necessarily proof of racism per se. Now, I have read his memoirs, and he certainly demonstrates racism nonetheless. I mean, he has assumptions, as did many people in the 19th century, many white people, and certainly enslavers in the South, that they were inferior and that they didn't feel pain. So it's still possible that decision was made easier on the part of Sims because he did buy into those theories. And the fact that, why did he primarily do his research on these bodies? Well, because white women wouldn't have subjected themselves to it. So regardless of whether or not we can prove that racism was intent in these procedures, it's still highly problematic. This is a time period where it was not appropriate for gynecologists to necessarily, I mean, whether we call it experimentation or relief for the patient who's suffering. Sims writes about how he wouldn't normally look at a genteel white woman and feel like it was appropriate to look inside their bodies unless it was absolutely necessary. So there's a race and a class divide here in terms of using these bodies to try to, advance the field of gynecology.
Is it during this period that he invents the speculum, or is he not solely, who was responsible for the invention of the speculum?
Well, it depends on who you ask. He's certainly known as the father of gynecology. And he does develop a speculum and of course it's called the Sims speculum. He's not the first. There had been sort of various types of models much earlier on. But in the 19th century, there's a doctor in France. He's credited with coming up with one in 1821. So he's not the first, but he is brilliant at kind of showcasing himself and taking all the credit. He was a friend of P.T. Barnum of circus fame, and he admired Barnum's showmanship, and he was extremely good at promoting himself. He goes to Europe to demonstrate his ability to repair vesicovaginal fistulas. He promotes his speculum. And as a result, what most people think is that he is the first to develop it.
Once he has perfected the use of the speculum, the fistula repair and so on enslaved women, is that when the showmanship begins, because he's starting to kind of trying to sell his wares privately to paying customers and the move to New York and so on? Is that the sequence?
Yes. He's famous for saying, introducing the bent handle of the spoon, I saw inside a woman what no one had seen before, something like that. And he's dealing with a woman who's fallen off a horse and her uterus is prolapsed. I mean, it's a long story, but it could be somewhat apocryphal, but basically that he figures out through a spoon in the process of trying to deal with this inverted uterus that he can see inside. And it suddenly occurs to him, okay, if I could come up with a tool that makes it easy to do this, I can see things that again, that can enable me to understand what is going on in there and then to do something about it. So symbolically, it becomes this literally eye-opening, this gaze inside a woman that for him was indicative of the potential for gynecology to really understand female anatomy, right? Unlike male anatomy, which is all you can see what's there, it had been hidden, right? It was mysterious and people didn't understand it. And now he's able to do it. So yeah, it comes hand in hand because it's through that use of the speculum that he can do these vesicovaginal repairs and then market it to the world.
And he's got women is it the Sims position where he's got women arranged in this very undignified posture where you're sort of on your hands and on your feet?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Not very nice for the patients. Whereas now, of course, the speculum is used when women are prone.
Yes.
So the speculum is made available in the 19th century, whether or not it Sims solely who invents it. But am I right that there's this period where actually doctors are quite reluctant to use them because there's this anxiety, particularly about using them on women who are virgins, and it's seen to be maybe it might break the hymen, that there's an anxiety surrounding it?
Yeah. There's this fantastic drawing that I love to use in my slides of a Victorian doctor who is examining a patient, we assume. She's standing up, she's fully clothed, and we see his arm we can assume it's reaching up under her skirts. But what's really interesting about the picture is the doctor's gaze he's looking the opposite direction, as is she. So, he's looking to the left, she's looking to the right. And it's symbolic of this discomfort, right? That this is so, modesty is so important in Victorian culture. And the very idea that someone other than a husband would touch this part of a woman's body is horrific, right? So how do you develop a field of medicine in which it's deemed okay to do so, right? That it's appropriate. And how do you convince a patient that she needs this, that she needs to be seen, looked at, touched, whatever? So there's a debate among gynecologists and obstetricians about whether the power of touch versus the power of seeing, what's more important? So some are arguing, of course we don't need a speculum because the gaze is inappropriate. Okay. It's pornographic or whatever. And a really good doctor should be able to understand everything through the touch of his fingers. And it's always a he, of course, touch of his fingers that will be lost if we're just reliant on technology to see something. It's about touch, not seeing. So that's part of the debate. But it really taps into this larger anxiety and angst about how can we create a field in which men are regularly looking at and touching the genitals. Okay. And so that's why I think their success came from first doing these kinds of things on enslaved women, because they didn't have the power and they were seen by many as less than human, or certainly less than white women. So the debate is about whether, at what point is this going to be acceptable? Now, obviously we know in hindsight that the speculum wins, right? We still use it today. People talk about how is it possible that we've gone centuries using the same, why have we not updated this instrument since Sims so long ago? But the reality is clearly they won in this debate, and the idea of being able to see won out.
And there are some innovators of the period, right, who are trying to move away from so presumably the women, the paying customers who are initially coming to gynecologists and accepting this use of speculum are those who have severe pain or problems that they really want resolved. There is then a move by doctors like Dickinson towards more lifestyle therapies.
Yeah. So this is really my favorite part. I mean, that sounds kind of sick, but the most fascinating part was to think about going from a time period in the 19th century in which doctors felt the need to propriety was so important. They had to emphasize that they were absolutely not interested. As Sims says over and over again, if there's any part of the female body I hated, it was the uterus. Like I had no interest in it. But, I had to do it because they were suffering. And it's like they have to portray themselves as so upstanding. They're morally upstanding. And they are representative of this new scientific field of gynecology. And so it's not that they want to do it or they want to think about what they're doing. They're doing it for the betterment of female reproductive health. Mm-hmm. So that begins to shift in the early 20th century when people are debating, well, where's the future of gynecology? Because up to then, primarily they're emphasizing surgery. But then what distinguishes them from surgeons? What makes their particular expertise different from, say, just a regular surgeon? What are they really interested in capturing here? And certain gynecologists, such as Robert Dickinson, who becomes the president of the American Gynecological Society, says we need to stop skirting around the issue of sex and talk about sex, right? So we want to help steer these women into proper roles. And what we're looking at has to do with issues of sexuality, right? And so rather than pretend that's not what we're doing, let's face it head on. Sorry, let's face it head on. But this is a really complicated conversation to have in the early 20th century because birth control, not surprisingly, is incredibly controversial. Gynecologists do not want to weigh in on the issue of birth control, certainly not on abortion. So it takes this young innovator like Robert Dickinson to say, I'm actually really interested in talking about this. I think we need to understand female sexuality and not pretend that's not what we're really interested in. So there's this shift even before the introduction of the pap smear to what I call preventive gynecology. So not just about health, but about ensuring that female sexuality is kind of contained within married heterosexual experiences. And that the gynecologist is the perfect person to guide these women into marital stability.
How much truth is there in the popular idea of the vibrator being one invented by, like you said, your gynecologist, and two, used on unwitting women to, this, you'll be familiar with the popular narrative around this.
Yes, there is a popular narrative. It's based on a book written by a historian that has since been debunked. So I had to be really careful when I was writing that chapter because of the fact that in popular culture, that assumption exists, that this was this outrageous story about female sexuality in which these doctors are regularly using vibrators to stimulate their patients who are struggling. A lot of the evidence used in that book, the technology of orgasm, was later found not able to be located. Let's just put it at that, right? So there was some creativity in looking at old sources. When I came across the papers of Dickinson, I was aware of this controversy. You don't see a lot about it in most medical textbooks, but Dickinson himself does, in fact, rely on some of these tools. Sometimes they're dildos. He uses several different terms, but he is definitely playing around with this idea. Mm-hmm. So it does exist. The context seems pretty disturbing in the cases that I looked at. It's definitely, I think, predatory. I'll put it like that. He would also photograph his patients' vaginas without their knowledge. He had a little pedal that he would step on and a flower pot with a hidden camera that would take their pictures. So a lot of stuff going on that I think is more than questionable. But I'm not convinced that it was as widespread as popular culture would like to believe.
Was he doing this for his own sexual gratification, or do we not know?
We don't know. I mean, that is difficult to say whether or not he was being sexually gratified the way we know about someone like Larry Nassar. Mm-hmm. He felt very concerned. He's a gynecologist. He's also a eugenicist. So he was very concerned about marital stability. And by the 1930s, there is increasing concern that the marriage rate is the depression, right? So the marriage rate is going down, the divorce rate is going up, fewer people are getting married, but then marriages themselves seem to be falling apart. And as a gynecologist who sees, hundreds, if not thousands of patients, he is recognizing that one cause is sexual tension or sexual an inability to orgasm, for example, is leading to, the decline of the marriage, and certainly leading to a decline in birth rates, right? So if they are staying married, they're not having sex because of pain. So his solution is to ensure marital stability. And sometimes that means helping women understand how to orgasm. And so in the cases that I looked at, he is trying to understand and demonstrate with these women that in fact they can climax.
So that's this kind of legitimate purpose that's offered. Are these cases of vaginismus as well? So women who can't be penetrated without pain?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, he is also making all kinds of other statements, reading into their genitalia to try to understand, believing that their genitalia gives him answers to questions that may or may not correspond to what they say are going on. So when he sees a patient and she has, for example, an enlarged clitoris, and she says she's not sexually active, he doesn't believe her. And writes about this, that the body never lies, essentially, that he can read things into it, including sexual abnormalities. So he is interested in upholding marriage and kind of what we would call heteronormativity. He's very concerned about sexual behavior, both outside of marriage and also same-sex sexuality. So he's trying to measure genitalia to try to see if he can read into who's sexually promiscuous, who's potentially masturbating, who's perhaps in a homosexual relationship, as a way of kind of shoring up those boundaries more generally.
It's a perpetual problem in these disciplines because, you'll know that it's still not that uncommon for male doctors to be convicted of sexual abuse within the clinical context. And of course, now we have safeguards in place, like having chaperones and all this kind of stuff. But it is just an inherent problem. You obviously want people, many of whom will be male, who have expertise and can cure disease and can help patients,
right,
to be performing this job. But also it will sometimes attract sex pests, right? Whether or not Dickinson was, he was clearly fairly dubious. How do you filter them? It's quite hard.
It is quite hard. And I think, to me, that was one of the reasons I wanted to write this book, is that it really is unlike other procedures in that where are the boundaries between what's a medical procedure and what's a sexual procedure, what's abusive, what's potentially curative, and this discomfort around talking about that. It was so radical for someone like Robert Dickinson, beginning in the 1920s, to talk about this, that they're interested in female sexuality. Part of the reason that was so controversial is that people didn't want to think that way. They'd prefer to picture the Victorian doctor who's sticking his hand up a skirt and looking away and sort of not addressing it on hand at kind of face value. Yes, I am inserting an object into your vagina. I'm putting my finger in there, right? But I've got a white coat on and I've got rubber gloves, and maybe there's a chaperone in the room, and you're going to look up at some pretty picture on the wall, and I'm going to distract you, and we're not going to talk about, what's really going on here. The potential for those boundaries to get blurred, especially when we don't talk about it, is what I feel pretty passionate about, that those conversations need to take place, because it is easy for those boundaries to happen. And what's disturbing, if you look at some of the 19th century concern on the part of doctors, the doctors weren't concerned that they were going to be turned on. They were concerned that the women would be somehow sexually stimulated by by the pelvic exam. And so they had to be careful not to stimulate the women. And whenever I talk about that in front of an audience, they laugh because
the women laugh.
If you had a pelvic exam,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there is nothing pleasurable about that ththing. So, but basically what I'm trying to say is everyone's kind of tiptoeing around that rather than kind of talking about, all right, this is an uncomfortable situation. How can we make sure that it's done properly, that people feel comfortable, that we understand why it's being done and what the outcomes are, et cetera, right? And too often, I call them white coat predators. It enables people to take advantage in certain situations in ways that can be absolutely devastating. So how do we balance that out? That there's a public health concern here. We want people to be able to be screened to deal with reproductive health issues, but how can we ensure that it happens in an appropriate setting in which women feel empowered to speak up and comfortable, and even if it's unpleasant, that it's just unpleasant and it's no more than that. It's not traumatic. It's not abusive.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.